हामीहरू डाक्टर रबिन कनिङहम डरहम युनिभर्सिटीको चाहिँ विशेषज्ञ जस्तो 1 दशक बढी भयो यो पुरै कपिलवस्तु क्षेत्रको अनुसन्धान गर्दै हुनुहुन्छ र निरन्तरता दिनुभएको छ नेपाली टिमसँग काम गर्दै. There is something happening here.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that is the best way to start our tour this evening.
Yes.
Could you tell us what is that implement and what is the gentleman doing?
Yeah. Okay. This is Duncan from Archaeological Services.
Right.
And the instrument Duncan has brought here is a magnetometer.
Right.
So what is critical about Duncan is that the instrument he is holding strapped onto him is recording the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field at a series of intervals of about 50 centimeters.
Right.
So when you have a brick wall under the surface, because a brick is made of clay, when you fire that brick in a kiln, it changes the magnetism. It becomes far more magnetic. So if you have a line of them in a wall under the ground, it means you have a more intense, a higher magnetic trait. So what Duncan is doing is walking back and forward in a grid and downloading it onto a microcomputer. This will then give us a pattern, a plan of where we have higher magnetic field and also lower magnetic field.
So earlier you would have to look at a mound and think perhaps there's something down there, but now you're able to actually not touch the surface, just walk on it.
Absolutely. And previously, archaeology, the great saying from Mortimer Wheeler is that all archaeology is destruction. Excavation is destruction because once you've dug a trench, you can't put the material back in. This way, it means we can evaluate quickly because it means you can do hectares coverage without actually damaging the soil beneath. Then you can target, this looks like an interesting building, this is where we want to put a road, let's excavate it, let's check it, which is why we've been so keen, and the Department of Archaeology has been very keen to use this to look at the landscape beyond the city walls.
That is what I wanted to get at now, because we think of Kapilvastu as just this unit inside the walls, but there has been a worry that this is a whole vast plain that has not been excavated. So what could happen? You could perhaps start by telling us the difference between what you see in Lumbini and what you see here.
Here we have a really well-preserved landscape, probably the best preserved early historic urban landscape in South Asia, without question. We have an extremely well-preserved walled city. And unlike many of the cities, say, within India or Bangladesh, which later had occupation, which meant people dug holes into the older structures, robbed out bricks to reuse, here we had general abandonment. So it means that many of the buildings were left untouched. So they're literally 20 centimeters below the surface. That in turn means that modern agriculture can very badly damage it. Now, traditionally, archaeologists are interested in the city and the walled part. Here, this landscape, we are standing on part of the old moat. And this side of Tilaurakot, Kapilvastu, we have double moat. We have one moat here, we have another moat there. And the landscape beyond, at the moment, just looks agricultural. But actually, just over there towards the east, we would have had one of the largest monastic complexes. So you can see just behind the tree, you see a low mound. That is the Eastern Stupa. That is the Stupa of renunciation.
As the Buddha left.
As the Buddha left.
So these posts indicate the active energy of the government of Nepal and the Department of Archaeology to reach out beyond the Kapilvastu compound to an area which would also be archaeologically valuable.
Absolutely, because instead of just protecting the core of the monument, it's the urban hinterland, it's the fortifications, it's the religious suburbs. To the south, we also have this huge industrial area.
One thing is clear, that Tilaurakot was the ancient hometown of and the capital of Suddhodana, the Siddhartha Gautam's father. But the surrounding area also has archaeological value, and now some of that is being brought in. So there will be, this much would already be now an archaeological site.
Yes.
But beyond that, what is the vision archaeologists like you have, the ideal world for Kapilvastu?
Yes,
Because
yes.
in a way Lumbini has a rigid mapping. This one
Yep.
is much more fluid, but a fluid space can also be destroyed.
For us, the approaches are either you build a wall,
Yes.
you build a wall around the site, you protect it.
Yes.
In a way that encourages just ribbon development
Right.
as you get today in
Yeah,
Lumbini.
yeah.
Also, the Kenzo Tangi master plan at that time was an accepted way.
Yeah.
It was a vision, but it's rigid. It's
Right.
3 miles by 1 mile. It doesn't respect nature. It doesn't really respect the archaeology too much.
Yes, right.
When here we have the opportunity of actually making the buffer zone, the core zone, the protected
right.
areas, actually mapped against the archaeology and the ancient landscape. So what we're preserving is not just the city, but also that landscape of communities, residential, religious, industrial, which actually all contributed to the concept of city.
Right.
Because Kapilvastu is not just a city, it's also the territory.
Okay. I think this is the best point from which for us to enter Tilaurakot, the ancient
Yes.
Kapilvastu, through the eastern gate. The Lord Buddha left in renunciation,
Yes.
but we enter in acceptance.
Yes, please.
Shall we?
Please.
Yes.
Here we're at the eastern gate, the gate of renunciation,
Right.
through which the Buddha departed to Siddhartha departed to become the Buddha.
Right.
What we have here are the final phases of the city's fortifications. And they're built in brick, as you can see.
Right.
They're also towers, so you have to imagine them much higher. Beyond, we have 2 moats here, so this is very well planned. One of the most striking aspects you see immediately is actually this pathway. Now, this is not just a modern pathway. This is actually constructed on top of the ancient pathway. So when you cast your mind down to what the city looked like, this would have been perhaps 10 meters wide, and there would have been shops and buildings on either side.
Okay.
And the whole of the city is divided into a cardinal grid plan with a series of gates across these walls,
Right.
probably 4 or 5 on each of the sides.
Right.
So the whole site is beautifully grid planned. And the most striking feature is that this grid plan is not just a late feature, but we believe that it's initiated in 600 BC, which is
Okay.
really extremely early for urban planning.
Yes. Wow, that's nearly, we're coming close to 3,000 years ago.
We are, and also it's before the great South Asian planning treatises
Right.
like the Manasara, the Arthasastra, which all have these very clear designations of how to build a correct city. Here we actually see evidence that before those are
Yeah.
codified and edited,
Right.
already people were creating cities, creating sacred space according to those plans.
Siddhartha Gautam.
And contemporary with that life. So when you think of cities,
Yes.
actually the cities we now understand were probably large settlements.
Right.
So what we find is this settlement is dates first to 800 BCE.
Right. Right.
And you have the Banganga River flowing towards the west, and you have 3 small settlements.
Right.
Then 6th century BCE, they are fortified
Okay.
within a single timber fence wall.
Okay.
This is the final one, which probably
All right.
dates to the Kushana period.
Okay. Try to place this whole space for me, because now we're going back 3,000
Yes.
years. And the whole settlement of humanity in the Gangetic plain,
Yes, yes.
where we would have thought that at that time this was jungle, and if anything, there'd be small aboriginal settlements,
Yeah,
if
yes.
that's the right word, in here. What would this place have been like? We now, through the effort of archaeologists like you, we have a we can even visualize the kind of city. But what about the countryside? How did it look like at that time?
The countryside, we now know, has a series of villages dotted around.
Right.
So there's an ancient village at Lumbini.
Right.
There's one close to Gotihawa.
Right.
There's one just along the road you've just come on at Dahani.
And between?
And in between, probably empty forest.
But the jungle or shrubland?
Probably jungle.
Okay.
That is the interpretation that we have. This area is, as you know, relatively low-lying,
Right.
floods many years. Some of the surveys in this area have suggested that the settlements are all based on slightly raised areas.
Right.
And this is to avoid flooding.
Right.
And when we've excavated the early levels here at Tilaurakot,
Right.
and also at Lumbini village mound, we have evidence of flooding.
Okay,
So
which
these-
they would have been lower.
So they were lower. So these early settlements are, in a way, trying to keep their existence despite the landscape.
Okay.
And the settlements are small.
Okay.
What is the major change is 6th century BCE, suddenly you get the establishment of a major urban form.
Right.
And this is really early for, as you say, that urbanization of
Right,
South
right,
Asia.
yeah.
So it puts us actually right on a par with the other developments of the early historic cities. And particularly now with the new evidence from the northern rampart,
Right.
where we have this early timber fence.
Right.
That sequence is actually one of the earlier ones that we
sequence, yeah.
have.
We will get there too.
We'll get there.
So now let's walk on the ancient grid path over which you've overlaid a wooden
That's right.
platform.
The
Yeah.
reason we've put this wooden platform is we're aware that the archaeology here is very rich.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was mentioning, the city was abandoned
Right.
and no one lived here. So the buildings are very close to the surface.
Uh-huh.
What we found was that increasing numbers of pilgrims have actually begun to wear away the archaeology on the surface. So this is a way of actually both giving the visitor an idea of the grid plan of the city,
Right.
but also protecting the site.
When you said earlier that the brickwork begins just 20 inches beneath the surface, but that's enough to do agriculture. Why did nobody come up here into the ancient city to conduct agriculture that they were doing all around over the centuries?
I should think two reasons. One is it's much drier because this is a natural mound.
Yeah.
So the mound is about 4 meters high above the surrounding area.
Okay.
The second is that when the site was rediscovered by P.C. Mukherjee of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1899,
Right.
it was one of the heaviest forested areas in this region.
Okay.
And when he was trying to survey the archaeological remains, he actually shared the site with a tiger.
There was an albino tiger.
There was an albino tiger living here.
Wow.
And in his record, he actually says he was rather frightened that as he was mapping, he was aware of this tiger at the site. And today even, actually, we're pleased that half of the site is still in a more sort of uncultivated state.
Yes.
Because actually there are jungle cat here, there are jackals.
Uh-huh.
So what was once a reserve is almost like a mini nature reserve.
So when somebody who's not an archaeologist comes here and looks at this space,
Yes.
they see a landscape. They have
Yes.
would have no clue what's in there. Now, without even going towards the excavated sites,
Yes. Yes.
would you look at this space right now and tell me what you see?
What I see is of course influenced by the geophysics.
Right.
But actually what you can see is, can you see a series of slight rises in the
Right,
ground
I do,
under the
I do,
trees?
yes.
Basically, wherever you see one of these large trees, their roots have benefited from rubble below.
Okay.
So actually what we have probably under most of these major trees are quite large collapsed brick structures.
Meaning the roots take from the mud.
They link into the rubble and they actually get the moisture from those.
Okay.
So if you were here during, say, the early historic period,
Right.
you would find this road actually about 10 meters
10
wide,
meters wide,
so
yes.
30 foot
All right,
wide.
right.
We've excavated either side, so we know in the later period there are a line of buildings along here,
Right.
a line of buildings along here, probably shops on the front, and then behind courtyard houses. So you have to imagine this very, very populated. In terms of what the houses look like, the floors are mud.
Yes.
The wall foundations are built in brick.
Right.
The walls are then mud.
Right.
And the roofs, most of the roofs are thatched.
So these are not, and when we go towards what would be possibly the palace area, you'll tell us more. But this is essentially from a present day perspective, like a village that we still find in parts of Nepal.
Yes.
Wattle and daub, mud walls with a timber core and thatch roofs.
And quite possibly, if you think of some of those Tharu villages where they
Right.
have the most beautiful applique mud designs,
Yes.
painting, probably like that as well.
Right.
But this is part of the challenge, I think, for visitors when they come pilgrims,
Yeah.
because they come with this concept of what ancient Kapilvastu looked like. High walls, beautiful marble palaces, arches.
Yes.
And even the local school children, we run a competition every year for designing, drawing what ancient Kapilvastu looked like. And there are domes, there are turrets, it's beautiful.
Right.
When you actually think of the historic reality of the city,
Right.
actually the walls are mud, the buildings are thatch, but still there are differences,
Right.
because back here,
Right.
behind that brick wall,
Right.
that is the palatial compound, that is
Maybe
the
go
center
towards
of the city.
Yeah. Yeah. Please keep talking.
And that we have evidence for very, very different structures. So out here,
Right.
most of the people have access to brick only for the foundation.
For the foundation, yeah.
And access, there's almost no access to tile.
Right.
This area was a real surprise because PC Mukherjee identified this area in front of us
Right.
as a possible palace of Buddha's father ?
Yeah.
So when you get large
In the
groups-
1890s when he
in
came
the
here.
1899 when he
Right.
came.
Yeah.
So most of the pilgrims come, they venerate here, and you can see the prayer flags over it. Now, on our geophysics, we were so surprised that actually at the center of the city, which is here,
Yeah.
this is where we have a walled compound.
So you ran that contraption
All over this
all
area.
over, and then you realize where are the streets, where are the walls, where are the thicker walls and the thinner walls.
Absolutely. And so what we had is an area in the center of the city,
Right.
at the center of the crossroads,
Right.
measuring about 100 meters by 100 meters.
Right.
And
Okay.
now archaeologists are often accused of calling monuments palaces, so we call it palatial,
Palatial.
a palatial complex.
So,
So here there is a slight kink in the walkway.
right.
Which may look odd, but actually this is the geophysical survey picks up
Right.
that the road here does kink a little.
Oh, I
So-
really
so
have
this-
to try to take this in. The road doesn't go, this pathway doesn't go straight.
It doesn't go straight, it actually slightly kinks here. We don't know why.
But the ancient path leading to that complex also turned here.
Also turned here.
and there would be houses here and houses
And we would have houses on either side.
here. Right.
And then we have this most incredible structure. And the dates of it, we're still debating the dates, but we've picked dates of the early historic period, probably 2nd, 3rd century BCE for this complex.
Okay.
Now, this was the most surprising of everything,
Right.
because if you look at what's in front of us,
Right.
this is the main northern road.
Right.
So you can see the northern road. Probably it entered from a gate,
Yeah.
the rampart there. It comes along, it kinks slightly here,
Right.
and then you have a wall on either side. And here you have a gate. So this is actually the gate complex. So this is an inner fortification. The outer wall, it's a high wall around, and then right at the center of the city, we have this wall, and you can see we're just clearing it along here for conservation. It's about 1 meter wide. So it's about 1 meter wide, and it runs 50 meters in this direction and 50 meters in that direction. The edges, the corners, are not angular, they are curved.
Right. Which indicates what?
Which indicates a very different style. We don't know quite what, because we've never found an early historic palace before.
Like this?
Like this.
At this age?
No one has found a monument like this before, which is why it's
in South Asia?
In South Asia, which is why it's so exciting. There is a monument in the center of Sisupulga, but we don't really know.
Where is that?
Sisupulga is in Orissa.
Okay.
We have the building known as Kumraha in Pataliputra in Patna.
Okay.
But again, we don't know what that structure is, and it's not walled, it's just a pillared hall. So what do you have to imagine? And this is one of our puzzles, because the wall is very low.
Yeah.
Now, if this was a high brick wall, you'd expect cascades of brick to be found, but they're absent.
Like we've seen some of the cascades
we've seen
at the Eastern
by
Gate.
the Eastern Gate.
Right.
Here we don't have that. So one of our interpretations is, I'm assuming you've been to Mustang.
Yes, indeed.
Now, Mustang, the walls there have foundations of stone, cobbled, but then it's rammed earth.
Right.
So we have two hypotheses, and with archaeologists we can only ever guess. You can't actually go back there. So one interpretation is it's never finished.
Right.
May be true, may not be true.
Yeah.
The other is actually the walls are made of rammed earth, and that they're probably capped therefore with thatch to keep monsoon rains off them.
Right.
But when you come here, you should imagine perhaps 6 meter high walls.
Because it is a fortification.
Because it's a fortification, and that width, 1 meter wide, would probably give you a height of 5 or 6 meters high. So you have to imagine that you have this blank wall stretching either side, and here you have this major entrance.
Right.
And this is not where the gate is, this is just a forecourt.
Yes.
So anyone coming in, you're surrounded by these walls, 5 to 6 meters high, and then you have a gate tower.
Right.
So this is the gate tower. We excavated here, and we excavated over there at the same point, and we found here evidence of a huge set of bricks for a post.
No rock in there?
No rock, just bricks. So we believe this is one gate.
Right.
We found another there. So you have to imagine this is where the gate is.
Yeah, not in here, but
Not in here, but here. So
and this is like a vestibule.
So this is like a vestibule, guard quarters. This is the gate. Now, this pattern, they've only ever found an entrance to the outer city with gate posts at again at Sisupulga. So it's really interesting that the archaeology we have here is so well preserved, and also it's so monumental. If you also look, we're at the highest point of the site.
Right. Yes.
So you can see the site dips away.
Right.
The buildings here, unfortunately, none are fully excavated, are very different from outside.
Okay.
Because when we've excavated them, outside the floors are mud.
Right.
In here, all of the floors are paved in brick. Outside, the walls are mud. Inside, we have evidence of the collapse of brick walls.
Which we'll get to see.
And sadly, they're all under the ground.
Okay.
But the walls are, some of them are 30 or 40 courses. Once you think of 30 or 40 courses of brickwork, you're probably dealing with walls that are about 3 meters high. So you have to imagine here, on the highest point, you have these very, very different buildings.
There's something palatial here.
Something palatial here. The investment is amazing. Also, we found fragments of broken relic caskets.
Right.
Out there, the buildings are very, very much much simpler.
Right.
Now, this trench is also really interesting because we have this very fascinating structure here. So this is early historic. This is part of the fortification.
Right.
And this building is later. Now, as an archaeologist, we know it's later because if you look, it's built on top of the fortification wall.
Over here.
Yeah. So you can see this is the old fortification wall, and you can see built on top.
Jumped over it, yeah.
Someone's actually built on top.
Yes.
And what we have is a courtyard building. So there is the central courtyard. Here are verandas.
Right.
And here you have individual rooms. Now, what is interesting, when the Chinese pilgrims visit here in the 1st century CE, they describe that they visit a largely abandoned city. They say the walls are still strong.
Right.
And they record the presence of a series of sangaramas on top of the old palace structures.
Which means somebody would have told them there was a palace structure here and we've built on top of it. And
when
that is proven, seems to be proven with what we see.
Absolutely. And as an archaeologist, when you see a structure like this, which is quadrangular, open courtyard, series of rooms around, you would normally interpret a structure like this as monastic.
Okay.
And also during the excavations of here, and there's another one just to the west, when we excavated here, we found potsherds which belong to alms bowls.
Okay.
And these are really distinct alms bowls. You'll see one of them in the museum tomorrow.
Okay.
These are big open alms bowls. We excavated one in the monastic area at Lumbini, which is why we know what they look like. Here, we haven't found complete ones, but we found parts of them. So this structure we see as a late structure built on top of the old palatial area, and actually we're linking it with monastic occupation.
Okay. What would be these holes on the brickwork?
So again, here we have foundations in brick.
Right.
And once they've built those, then they cut a hole, and this would be one of the posts. So the timbers, so you have to imagine again that the walls are mud.
Right.
The roofs are thatch.
Right.
And this is because in summer when it's hot, they're wonderfully insulated.
Okay.
In winter when it's cold, again, they're extremely well insulated. And sadly, once the building's abandoned, the mud melts.
Yes.
And it just covers up the building. So much of what we encounter when we excavate is just the melted walls.
Yes.
Which over time have just been...
But in a way they have protected the space.
They've protected the space. We also have made modern bricks of the same size, and we protect the brickwork, the original brickwork below. But what we've done is wherever there was a post hole, we have replicated.
Okay.
Now, you might ask, why don't we show the original brickwork?
Right.
Part of the reason is illustrated by this. Many pilgrims, when they come, are deeply moved because once in their lifetime they have the chance of visiting the childhood home of the Buddha. And many of them are tempted to take back perhaps a religious souvenir.
Right.
And for them, it's a chance of a lifetime.
Right.
So these layers are actually sacrificial. You have a really good idea of the, here we have the wall running along here with and that's the early historic palatial compound.
Right.
Now, just inside, we have evidence of a series of buildings built afterwards.
Okay.
And 2 years ago, we actually excavated from within the floor a pot containing Kushana coins.
Okay.
So we are more or less aware that once the early historic palatial compound is abandoned, then you have a series of quadrangular structures built here, which seem to date from the Kushana period.
Okay.
And when P.C. Mukherjee arrived, he recorded, very interestingly, a note of a Deva Temple. And he located it here. And here, you can see it's raised up. You can see it's slightly higher. And this is all rubble.
Okay.
So what we have here is the old city wall running along here, the palatial wall.
Right.
Then we have another quadrangular structure here. So it's a huge quadrangle.
Right.
In the middle of the quadrangle, we have this very, very high mound of rubble. Some of the brickwork seems to be carved.
Okay.
So what we're wondering is whether we have the abandonment of the old palatial compound. Then we have, during Kushana period, we have the construction of a monastic compound. And then on top of it, we have perhaps what we believe is a shrine. So this season, we've just removed the backfill, and this is where we'll excavate this
season.
This season.
Yes. So you're picking up from what you know from your echo machine.
Yes.
Where interesting places are. Then you choose a place for a year or two,
Yes.
and you move on.
Yes, and we think that's best. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but we used to say archaeology is like gambling.
Right.
Beginning of the season, you take your entire budget, you put it on one square. That's where you excavate.
Hit or miss.
Hit or miss,
Right.
absolutely. Which in a way is very difficult to predict.
Yeah.
With the geophysical survey, it means you can actually purposefully have a research question every season.
Okay.
You can say, this structure, we want to understand it. This structure. Now, it's really
Right.
well illustrated by, if you look over here.
Right.
So, I'm an archaeologist. Can I revert the question to you?
Yes.
And ask you, what do you see of the topography here in front of us?
I see low hill and dale.
Absolutely, and also it's very rich grass.
Yes. Oh,
so
down here, yes.
so if you look, you're almost looking into a basin,
Yes, indeed.
and this is one of the areas which is really interesting because the path here
Right.
follows the old wall. So the old road. So you've got
Right.
the road. It's gridiron.
Right.
Here it dips down,
Right.
and in wet season it collects water.
Uh-huh.
Now, we've put in trenches here because the geophysics picked up a huge area of very, very high magnetism, a square, measuring about 30 meters by 30 meters.
Whoa, that's 90 feet by 90 almost.
But the most puzzling is the center was empty.
Right,
Nothing.
right,
Nothing in
right,
the center from the geophysics. So it suggests that it wasn't a building because we just had a very thick
Right,
wall.
right.
When we excavated, we identified it's actually a tank.
Tank.
And the walls of the tank are actually built in brick.
Right.
And it's about 3.5 meters deep.
Okay.
It measures 27 meters by 27 meters. The most striking feature of that tank is firstly it's built into the plan of the city.
Right.
So it's not an afterthought.
Right.
It's an integral part of the plan of the city.
Yes, yes.
And also its date is Mauryan, 3rd
Right,
century
right.
BCE.
Okay. So there may have been a pond here, which they would have
But they-
elevated to a tank.
To a tank. And the tank is really striking because for the Mauryan period, we have no known examples of civic architecture or infrastructure. When here in the city, we actually have built into the urban plan.
Right.
Now, one of the games I play with colleagues is there is a missing link in the archaeology of Nepal between what we have here in the Terai,
Right.
urban development, urban form, and the Kathmandu Valley. And that gap is beginning to shrink and shrink and shrink. And the question I have for colleagues is, to what extent does a city plan like this begin to anticipate what you get in the Kathmandu Valley? The use of the gridiron streets, the use of water, which the tanks are an integral part. Here, we actually have evidence of that. And Professor Maskey, the
Right.
architect
Right.
from Tribhuvan University, was here last year. And we had evidence of a roof collapse,
Right.
tile roof, at the edge of the tank. And underneath the tiles, there was lots of clay, very clean clay. And one of the techniques, as you know, for construction in the Kathmandu Valley, is on top of the boards of the roofs, you have thick clay and then the tiles. So it's really tempting to begin to think of the antecedents of the Kathmandu Valley, actually perhaps here in the Terai.
So what we have in the Terai, and specifically here in Kapilvastu, the Tilaurakot, moat and fort and habitation, is a link to Kathmandu Valley, of course, but also to the rest of South Asia. Can you give me a sense of why one has to be, as I hear you speak, enchanted by the prospects of what this mound, this ancient township teaches us about our South Asian heritage?
When we first started excavating here, the most striking point was the material culture, the pottery, the coins, the terracotta objects that you find here. I was wondering, would we find something remarkably different? But actually, the material culture here is almost exactly the same as you find from the excavations at Hastinapur.
Right.
Almost exactly the same as the material you find in, say, Taxila.
Right.
So it's part of that unified urban growth where, for that emergence of early historic cities and states, it's not that they're separate from each other.
And that one would be a center more developed and a periphery would be less developed, because in many ways the technology of urban planning was already here.
Absolutely. Yes. And the idea that, and we found this in Sri Lanka as well, that the idea that areas which are slightly further out from the Ganges are slightly slower in development isn't the case. We have this amazing mosaic of urban forms developing from the old kingdom of Gandhara all the way down to the south in Sri Lanka. And also, these sites are not in isolation.
Yes.
Because
they are connected.
They're all connected. We have that connection in terms of agate.
Right.
So we have pieces of agate which are from Western India.
Right.
We have material that's moving round. We have coins here from the 3rd century CE from Ayodhya.
Right.
So this is not an isolated place. This is absolutely core.
Part of commercial links that existed throughout.
Commercial links, diplomatic links. It's an integral part. And also, the other feature is that when you look at that route from Lumbini to Tilaurakot that you drive on, that you drove on today, if you were traveling in the early historic period, you would have done that journey probably over 4 or 5 days. And on that road, and you will have driven past, there are a series of way stations between 13 and 15 kilometers apart, to support the movement of trade, pilgrims, officials. East-west. Almost on the same alignment as the modern road, we have the ancient road. And some of them are way stations, fortified enclosures. Others are mass-produced wells. Now, we've only seen 30 kilometers of this. But we're assuming that actually this must be a much, much longer...
highway.
A major highway.
With caravanserais.
With caravanserais, wells.
So, one question I'll ask you at this point is linking Kapilvastu to the rest of South Asia, or at least the Gangetic Plain, would be that this is part of the Uttar Path, the ancient road that comes from way out east towards Taxila, Gandhara, towards Delhi, Hastinapur area. This would be part of it. Might that explain, and the caravanserais that you have already located indicates that might well be the case. Could it be that this was a prosperous place? Why would 3 historical Buddhas, as confirmed by Emperor Ashok, be born in this 30 square kilometer area if this were not some kind of an urban hub?
This is a very well developed urban hub, and also we're not dealing with just villages and the city. We've now, with the geophysics, picked up towns as well.
Okay.
So, for example, at Panditpur, towards
Right,
the west,
right.
geophysics last year picked up evidence of a big urban form under the fields.
okay.
The site of Sisania, close to the Indian border,
Right.
has had a series of archaeologists working there. We've now done geophysics there over the last 2 years. It's a town. It's a town with a grid plan
Okay.
laid of streets. It has also monastic complex. It's like a miniature model of this site.
Could it be then that, again, going back to the happenstance, some would have
Yes.
said, of three Buddhas, Kakushanda, Kanakmuni and Sakyamuni, being said to have been born in these areas south of the Chure Hills,
Yes.
in the plains of present-day Nepal. Could it be that this place was more developed than other parts of present-day South Asia, further south of us? Maybe this was the highway. This was the happening place.
In terms of population, this is a major area of population.
Of how many years ago?
The earliest occupation is 1300 BCE,
BC, okay.
but by the early historic period, we have a hierarchy of settlements with this city, the capital city at
Right.
its peak.
Right.
Then we have the smaller towns, the villages. So all of this, we shouldn't think of this area as being, shall I say, underdeveloped or peripheral.
back then.
This is absolutely core. What is clear as well is those corridors,
Right.
cultural corridors,
Right.
which are corridors for the exchange of ideas, of goods, of faith, exchanging along these. They are undoubtedly corridors of development.
Okay. Without being a specialist, I'll propose a thought that comes to me.
Yes, yes,
Which is, if there is this ancient highway called the Uttarapath,
yes,
like today Nepal east to west, the east-west highway
yes, yes.
is now developing into a one city almost through ribbon
Yes.
development.
Yes,
There's a highway
yes.
and everything is built all around it.
Yes.
So if there was a Uttarapath, then this is where things would be happening.
Yes.
And south of us towards the Ganges, it would be more jungle, dense, without, and maybe more flooding because they're further into the plains. Whereas here we're still on a kind of a highland, a talus slope. So it could be that later on, the further development of the plains and the getting rid of the jungles meant that the population centers and the areas of high learning and the great kingdoms all moved south. But back then it might have been here.
I think what you've hit on is
Yes.
one of the challenges that archaeologists have failed with and ancient historians, that when we talk about kingdoms
Right.
or even empires like the Mauryan Empire, we tend to, for example, with the Mauryan Empire,
Right.
draw a line round the outside.
Yes.
And everything within is shaded. And we draw that line based on the location of edicts.
Right.
And we think of it as almost like an ink blot
Right,
or an ink
right.
stain.
Yeah.
And we assume that all of the area within that area is at the same level of integration and development.
Right.
There are some really interesting alternative perspectives, which I think are ones that actually fit the evidence here.
Right.
That if we think of corridors
Right.
as being a key element for the exchange of goods, of ideas, they're
Pilgrims, people.
pilgrims, people, artists,
yes.
craftspeople,
Yes.
that actually the corridors are the most vibrant and the most developmental and experimental. So if you reimagine the Mauryan Empire, not as this blob
Right.
with shaded area, equally shaded area, but actually you should think of cities like this one,
Right.
cities like Shravasti is another
right.
one, and these corridors running between them
Right.
as corridors of innovation
Right.
in a way.
Right.
So it's partly that when we publish papers, we love drawing the lines round.
Right. Right. So when you say corridors of innovation,
Yes.
then one aspect of innovation is spiritual quest.
Yeah.
So there is a link between economic growth, some amount of leisurely crafts and leisurely activities, which allows people to be thinkers.
Yeah.
These are all made possible by urban growth and economic activity. And only then will there be possibilities, speaking very rationally as a rationalist,
Yes.
possibilities for spiritual seekers to become enlightened people, and hence the Buddhas.
I appreciate this, and
Right.
and the innovation that you have, certainly within South Asia, includes coinage.
Right.
And for me, when you see a coinage, most people think this is useful for dating.
Right.
A coin.
Right.
But also, if you think of what a coin represents, it represents the power to translate something which is perishable,
Right.
something that will not last more than a week, say milk,
Right.
into something imperishable, very lightweight and
Right.
very transportable. So with the innovation of coinage as well,
Right.
you have a revolutionized impact of translating from perishable
Right.
materials into imperishable,
Right.
into the movement of this power and authority.
Right.
And also, in reaction to that, you have twofold. You have some who dislike or distrust the innovation that's offered, and also those who feel perhaps now they have more authority because they have more wealth,
Right.
but they are locked into their social and not their economic position, but perhaps their social, maybe even ritual position,
This will be Suddhodhan and Siddhartha. Yes.
despite
Right.
actually having wealth.
Right.
So at that point, you have actually this huge patronage.
Right.
And the patronage is for people offering alternative routes, alternative hierarchies, not a single hierarchy, but also what we like to call heterarchy,
Right. Right.
where you have multiple sort of
Right.
leaderships.
Yes.
And it can't be a surprise that you have the Jain movement,
Right.
you have Gautama Buddha, you have these other leaderships, the Ajivikas,
Yeah. Ajivikas.
all at this time where you have both this challenge to existing society in that you have a new urban, wealthy, mercantile middle class, but also you have people repelled
Yes.
at the new world.
But what is interesting, if we are to believe that there was Kanak Muni and Krakushanda and Sakya Muni evolved of this
Yes.
earth, of this Kapilvastu earth, that there's something not something extra that was going on here, but like where the Ajivikas were, where the Jain movement began, this is the actual grassroots place of Buddhism.
It is, and for me, when you go to Niglihawa,
Right.
what is really interesting is the inscription,
Right.
because the inscription is one of the few which actually mentions one of the previous Buddhas.
Right. Okay.
And it shows that by the 3rd century BCE, there is already that understanding of previous individuals.
Yes. Right.
Now, what is interesting is there are times at which tangible and intangible begin to
Right.
disjoint.
Right.
And if you then go to Auroracote, just
Right.
behind it, you may think this is the natal home.
Yeah. Of Kanak, Kanak Muni or Krakushanda?
Kanaka Muni.
Yes.
Now, what is interesting is we've been working at that site,
Right.
and it's a fascinating site. It's over 1,000 meters by 1,000
right.
meters.
Oh.
The interior is almost entirely empty.
Right. Yes.
So unlike here, where all of this area is covered by houses,
Right.
at Auroracote it's empty.
Empty.
But if you look at the architecture with the geophysics,
Right.
it has a wall on the east and also on the south.
Right.
And in the wall, there are a series of half-moon bastions.
Right.
Now, it is exactly the same as Sirsuk in the Taxila Valley.
Okay.
And what we have there is not an early historic city.
Okay.
We have there a
Right.
Kushana imperial outpost.
So this would be where soldiers would be. So that's
So the
fortification
reason
that you have.
it's a barracks.
Alright, it's a barracks. Yeah.
And the reason why it's empty is because the Kushanas, we know, are mobile, they're swift,
Right.
and also it shows the point at which the urban history changes here. It changes from deep agglomerations of communities within walls and around,
Right.
and it moves to a very dispersed form of urbanization. And in a way, it's the point at which we begin to get deceleration in this area, deurbanization.
Okay.
And the challenge that we have is, why does that happen?
Right.
We don't yet know. But what happens is all of these cities are then abandoned. And instead of cities... Including this city.
Yes.
So it's abandoned. And what we find is over at Mai Temple, we have the last monument built here.
Right. Which is a Hindu...
Which is a shrine to Lord Vishnu. And the bricks are carved and they're moulded.
Right.
So they are similar to the bricks that we find at Kodan.
Right.
Over the river, they're similar to the ones at Chatraday.
So what would have led to the collapse of the habitation?
This
we do not know.
is not just a collapse here. It's something that appears to happen over most of the old early historic world. The city forms are lost. We get deurbanization.
Right.
In their place, some people would argue, we begin to get feudalism developing.
Right.
And so in the place we get agglomerations like this become fewer and fewer.
Yeah. Right.
And actually we find temple sites being constructed, but the population is dispersed across the landscape.
So in a way you are giving me some food for thought as a layman, because what I think is urbanization and development of thinking classes as a result of the economy leads to people, individuals moving towards spiritual quest, and they become Buddhas. But then if the urban civilization collapses, then possibly the possibilities of Buddhahood also collapses. I know I'm making a very simplistic point, and you certainly cannot agree with me because this is a hypothesis I'm throwing out there. But your reaction?
There is another. I think reality that I would see.
Right.
That when you look at the city, say during the Kushana period, before it completely collapses, when we've excavated in individual houses, all of them have terracotta figurines.
Right.
And these are probably religious figurines.
Right.
So inside the city, we have almost folk religious devotion. Outside the city, at the eastern Stupa, we still have this huge monastery.
Right.
So we sometimes move towards a single model too quickly.
There's no single model.
And actually, if you look at people today, they have multiple affiliations.
Right.
Although the census says, are you, say UK census says, are you Christian, are you Muslim, are you Hindu, etc., which are very neat things. Most people would see themselves almost as a range.
Right.
That something like census tries to focus on a single tick. Here, people living in the city had their tradition of the great monasteries outside, but inside they have perhaps more of a folk tradition of terracottas, which are as significant. And if you look at the excavations at other sites like Taxila, even Sonk, we have this similar pattern of almost two traditions. A great tradition and then a more sort of folk home tradition.
And so when we are carried away by the vision of the Lord Buddha, having been born here, having exited from here, renounced the good things of life, we should not forget the life of the common people here either. And what made them move about, what excited them, what they did, because we may want to put in the burden of Buddhism on this place, which also need not be the case. They would have parallel lives.
Parallel interests, affiliations, And also many of the places of pilgrimage are not just for a single community of pilgrims, but multiple pilgrims. So what many of us would call fuzzy boundaries, there are so many fuzzy boundaries today. Why should the past be any less complex?
Let me go now to your sense. You've been excavating here for about 15 years?
10 years. I just look old.
I introduced you as 10 years. So let me restart that question. You've been excavating in the Kapilvastu area for 10 years. I'd like to ask you one question about the historicity of the Buddha, the Sakyamuni.
Yes.
In that, this place makes him real. There are so many other faiths where we have to rely on so much of mythology or memory, whereas here so much is concrete. As an archaeologist studying what many would consider a god, how do you take to Lord Buddha?
It's an interesting one. I was brought up as a Catholic, and I was very surprised when I first started working here and at Lumbini, because when my youngest son was at nursery, when I first started working at Lumbini, when at school they sat people down in the nursery school and they said, what do your parents do for a living? And my oldest son said, my mother is a teacher, my father is a policeman.
Right.
And the teacher said to my wife, I didn't know your husband was a policeman. And then we quizzed my son and we said, why did you say I'm a policeman? And he said, Daddy, I am so embarrassed that you are an archaeologist. Everyone will think I'm odd. Now, after I worked at Lumbini and then worked here, my youngest son went to nursery school. And they sat down and they did, what does your mother and your father do? And he said, my mother is a teacher and my father works for the Buddha. So it was interesting. Their interpretations changed.
What you do,
For us working at a site like this, though, it's always a privilege, because when you see pilgrims surrounding an excavation trench, and you see their devotion, and you're aware that this may be their one trip here, and you actually see a responsibility that actually sites like this are protected, and also that sites like this are interpreted to a degree. Because one of the challenges is, you come here, does this look like a city? No. So somehow we have to try to bring the concept of the city alive in this way.
The historicity of the Buddha, which we all know to be there, depends in that sense in the archaeology of the Kapilvastu area. And that is what you're doing. You're trying to bring to life, to the vision, the kind of place people back then lived, and among the people back then was the Sakyamuni.
Absolutely, and understanding the background, the development of that is all key, but also it's moving away from that view of Kapilvastu as domes and towers, to an understanding that in the early historic period, in that very early period, actually this was probably one of the most developed cities, but it had a timber fence. Its buildings were timber and thatched, and its roads weren't paved, they were mud. So when you begin to see the city like that, for many people, for them that historicity is too far.
And yet I think history can be, in a very proper sense, a leveler. We are able to look at Bhagwan Buddha for what he said he was. Because this is where he came from. There was not the opulence that have been ascribed to Kapilvastu. There were some small palatial buildings, thatched houses around a moat,
Yes.
clearly a very important city of that time, but from a modern day perspective of what we have been told would
Yes.
have been the opulence of the past, there was very little of that from what
Yes.
you see.
Yes, absolutely. But having said that, what is key is that actually those networks, those communications. So for me, P.C. Mukherjee,
Right.
who came here 1899, just
Right.
clearing jungle with a plane table,
Right.
he was the pioneering archaeologist who began to look at that approach of the Archaeological Survey of India, which was to use the Chinese pilgrim descriptions and to look at the historical topography. Bodh Gaya is one of those sites. Sarnath is another site. Sanchi, all of these key sites,
Yes.
they are unlocked with the use of the Chinese pilgrim descriptions.
So I'm so glad you mentioned the Chinese pilgrims. They get due credit, Wansang and Fasin and
Yes.
everybody else. But so glad you mentioned P.C. Mukherjee as your predecessor here and the predecessor of your colleagues,
Yes, of
Dr.
course.
Kosh,
Yes,
Prasad and others. It's a long line of people who discovered this place even though there was a albino tiger in the vicinity.
yes.
And at that time they didn't have this machine to go around with for sound echoes of the
Yes,
ground.
yes,
So
yes.
you must feel privileged to be of that line of scholar archaeologists who study this ground and this mud and this earth.
It is a privilege, and we are aware that for us with the geophysical equipment, the technology gives us that opportunity, so we shouldn't gamble, we shouldn't waste the resources we have, we should really focus them.
Okay.
Which is why we're able to actually take that view of protecting not just the walled city, but its residential, industrial, religious hinterland.
Right, right.
And also, which is why now we're able to protect more of that ancient roadway.
And you found the Department of Archaeology and the government of Nepal responsive to this need to go beyond the walled city?
Absolutely. I mean, for us, the debate is sustainability. So is it plausible for a foreign team
Yes.
to actually work and to make impact? The results of our geophysics have been translated into risk maps
Yes.
to say this is very important below the soil, it is at risk. Government of Nepal through Department of Archaeology has then actually picked up the baton
Yes.
and selected land and protected it. And for us, one of the most exciting points was investing in the new museum.
Yes.
Because the old museum was, at the time in the 1970s, built by Mr. Mishra,
Right.
absolutely visionary.
Okay.
To buy the land,
Yes.
to buy that plot,
Outside
to protect
the
the site.
precincts.
And outside, not on the site, really, really perfect. For the government of Nepal to build that museum demonstrates their commitment to this. That they then commission geophysical survey in other sites within Nepal is also key. So within the Kathmandu
And
Valley,
I might, yes, please continue.
so also Simrangaon,
Right.
and then Ramagrama, where, as you know, there is the Stupa
right,
surrounded by fields. Geophysics below the surface has demonstrated there are a series of monasteries
Okay.
surrounding it, monasteries and tanks. So government of Nepal through the Department of Archaeology has actually recognized
Yeah.
that this sort of innovation is critical, and now is the critical time, because I refer to the Bairoa airport
Yes.
as the time bomb.
Yes. The international airport, when it gets started, when it starts working a year or two from now, the population growth and the economic boom, which will mean a building boom, which will mean that this Uttar Path
Will be
will be covered up before we have
absolute
even time to
and
catch up.
irreversible.
Yes, yes.
So I think everyone from UNESCO, Government of Nepal, Department of Archaeology and LDT realize if we don't move now, and which is why we're here during a pandemic,
Right.
because this is not purely academic research.
Right.
This is applied practice. The more we can understand and protect and raise awareness is actually critical.
I'm so glad that the Department of Archaeology, which is sometimes tends to receive stepchildly treatment, because it's part of the Ministry of Tourism.
Yes.
Tourism is where the glitz is.
Yes.
And the Department of Archaeology is not given due importance even by the public.
Yes.
And we are hoping that there will be a time when archaeology will be a prized professional calling for scholars. And so what you do here will hopefully excite them to live the past through their hands in what they research.
And some of those successes, from the beginning, we wanted not this to also include students. And from Tribhuvan University and also Lumbini Buddhist University, because in a way we can train, we can work with current officers. The next generation is critical. And we've had generations now for 10 years of students coming and being trained here. An opportunity unavailable to the majority of their peers within Southern Asia. And we've brought colleagues from Pakistan, from India, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh to work with them as well. So they get the opportunity.
You were just telling me that this type of opportunity is actually not available in many parts of South Asia.
Most of South Asia, it's not available.
Why so?
Because the technology is not really adopted. Even the Archaeological Survey of India doesn't really yet recognize geophysics. These sorts of excavations, linked as they are to surveys of visitors, work within the museums, the holistic approach is one which is not applied across South Asia. So they get an opportunity, whether they continue into archaeology or not. And Shanti Sharma, the new curator of this museum, she first came as a master's student from Tribhuvan University. And now she's gone through that process of learning, and she's now an officer in charge of the museum. So in a way, that next generation, to have been exposed, to be aware, that is critical. Absolutely critical.
And looking over there is jungle. At least here there is some kind of clearing.
Yes.
So what would be in there?
Over there we
Is there a pathway that goes in there?
No.
Okay.
But that area is as occupied as this. What we decided to do was, this is one of the few places left within the area of any wildness, any jungle.
All right.
And what we did with the geophysics when we were doing the clearing, we did the clearing in phases. And we found actually...
And there was a jungle like that here?
And here as well. And we actually thought there is almost an ecosystem here.
Yeah.
Jungle cat, there are jackals, there are porcupines, all in there. And actually, do we want this to be an empty desert? Or by working on half of the site, presenting it, do we detract by letting that be a habitat?
And leave it to the imagination
and
as
leave
to
it,
how it was here for the last few hundred years.
Absolutely. So I like that form of preservation. That
also, we have the privilege of having all of this. And if we get a sense that all of that is where households like these, rather than some other kind of structures, then leave it to the imagination.
Leave it to the imagination. So we see this as a shrine that you come in, or maybe as a merchant you're going out to join the pathway of the corridor. And actually this seems to be some form of shrine very close to the entrance.
What might the ingot
we don't
signify?
know. It's clear they're smelting iron here. So one of the productions of that must be these massive ingots. From none of the other excavations we've found these ingots. So it means that the ingots are for shipping out. And they are massive iron. Heavy. And they're similar in shape. We've conserved one of them, and it's in the museum. And if you were to pick it up, I think it's about 400 kg. It's massively heavy. So what we see this is some form of shrine. And again, if you were to imagine, say, the Kathmandu Valley, You know, you go into, say, Bhaktapur,
Right.
you have these small courtyards, you have shrines, you have buildings. Actually, again, this gives us a sense of what the city's like. And other parts of the city, they're not all beautifully built brick. Some of them are poorer built.
Since we're right next to the gate,
Yeah.
at the end of this walkabout
Yes.
through Tilaurakot, could you tell us a bit about the ramparts and how they seem to have evolved? Because we have some images which we will show.
Yes.
But please describe it.
Yes, certainly. What we have in front of us is currently from the Kushana period.
Yeah.
And the ramparts have on top of them a brick wall. That brick wall is later supported by what seem to be towers.
Right.
So at the end of its life, you have to imagine a high brick wall with a series of towers.
How high?
Probably another 5 meters, perhaps.
Okay.
So from outside, you'd have a view across the moat to a high brick wall and a series of towers. Now, that was built on top of an earlier form of fortification, which was a clay rampart. This seems to have been built more or less 1st, 2nd century BC, because we have Sunga plaques within it. And cut into it in places, we found very large holes for posts. So before that brick wall, the wall was fortified with a clay rampart with a timber fence on top. And probably the clay is dug out from the moats
the moat,
beyond.
yes.
So that natural clay is brought in, built up. Now, that was what was known about the fortifications. When we excavated towards the north, we excavated a trench and we found that clay rampart had been built directly on top of a slot. The slot followed the same axis north-south that we find, and cut into the bottom of the slot were a series of post holes, not unlike the post holes here. So when you think about the first city wall, it's not brick, it's not marble, it's not fine plaster, it's actually timber.
Timber. And at that time, not even a rampart, just on the ground.
And we have 2 phases from 6th century BC,
6th
century BC of these timber posts. And you will see in the museum, because we felt this was so important, that we took a cast and then we've cast it in gypsum and we've made a reconstruction in the museum.
So when habitation began, perhaps 6th century, 8th century BC, people came here, they decided this was a safe enough place to be, maybe productive countryside, a river by the side, a good place for a fort to protect oneself. And so in the beginning they just created a timber wall.
And probably with that, we already know by 8th century BC, we have a settlement here, just under the modern Samaj Temple. We have one beyond to the north. We have one just outside in Shivagar. But it's this one that in the 6th century builds that wall round. And what's interesting is it's a large area, 400 meters by 300 meters. It's also a huge investment in labor at that time, which means you have to coordinate, organize, you need to support with subsistence, people building it. And also, it's unlikely that all of the area in the inside was occupied at one time. So perhaps they were also including some fields as well. So I think the early idea of city, the fortification is not just the habitation, it's probably maybe a tank, maybe some fields, and the
open plazas.
That's right. But this political decision to build such a large structure, which means political power and the ability to agglomerate, to bring in other communities in. And that, for me, is really the start of the urbanized process here at the city.
This is great. It's been an oral essay from you to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.